lies and misinformation. Argumentative tactics have been weaponized and used to cover up where there are errors in the Christian interpretation, translation, and understanding of the Hebrew. And today we have such a case from the brilliant, and I will happily say brilliant as he simply is a brilliant mind, apologist, YouTube apologist, Testify. Remembering that up, Steve?
Yep.
Today we're going to be reviewing and critiquing where Testify has made these errors and fill in where the information has either erroneous or misrepresented. So let's get this going.
Let's do it.
What is the most famous insertion into the Bible?
Ooh, the longer ending of Mark.
Virgin birth.
I'm gonna restart that.
What is the most famous insertion into the Bible?
Ooh, the longer ending of Mark.
Virgin birth. You got it.
What? All that manuscript evidence that we have for Matthew and Luke shows that the virgin birth stories are original, so she must mean some other kind of insertion.
Certainly not going to find it in the Gospel of Mark or Paul's writings, and it would take another 50 years before Matthew and Luke would first.
I just want to make a quick comment on that. What he's really doing there is just asserting a very basic fact. Everyone will agree that the virgin birth narrative is found in Matthew and Luke exclusively.
Right.
And so he's establishing an amount of credibility at the opening of his video, saying, here's some information, I know what I'm talking about. So I just want to have this floating in the air, this understanding of he's setting up a bit of credibility. And so I just want that to be hanging there as we watch the video progress. Go ahead.
I think the insertion idea too. She's stating that the insertion cannot not just be wholly textual, but also, pragmatic. It can be an idea, a theology, an ideology. A misrepresentation. Mm-hmm. He's coming from the stance of just a textual insertion, right? So we can keep it going.
Introduce the idea of a virgin birth, but
man, not another argument from silence. Just because a historian didn't write about something doesn't necessarily mean that they believe that it didn't happen. At best, this is very weak evidence. Grafton's Chronicles mentions the reign of King John, but never mentions the Magna Carta. Seems like something you would expect to be mentioned. We have an extensive diary from the Civil War general Ulysses S. Grant. He says absolutely nothing about the Emancipation Proclamation, despite writing basically daily. That's a bit strange. Neither the Greek historians Herodotus or Thucydides provide any details about Rome or the Romans in their histories of ancient Greece. That seems to be like a pretty big oversight. Are you going to be like some of the other kooky TikTokers out there and say that Rome didn't exist too? There are also biblical scholars and not just desperate apologists who would argue that Luke and Matthew were written much earlier than the 80s. See Jonathan Bernier's book, which I will link in the description down below.
This time Christianity had left Jerusalem and headed into the Roman Greco world where...
So the first thing I really note on this is that you can make the argument like he makes here that it's just an argument of silence. But the simple fact is the virgin birth isn't mentioned prior to Matthew and Luke. And so he segues with this into an argument for an earlier dating of the Gospels, and that's probably his real argument, is trying to get an earlier dating. And there's a lot of evidence that goes into what the dating would be. I tend to lean more towards Marcion priority, which puts the Matthew a little bit later, and actually I think moves Luke into being a little earlier maybe, but it puts them both 2nd century. So, and there's a lot of evidence that supports that. The PhD candidate right now, he's making his rounds in interviews, Jack Bull. He's presenting a lot of good information on this as well, and I've looked into it as well. I've read through reconstructed version of Romans, scholars trying to rewrite Marcion's version of Romans. And from what I've been able to see, it is actually much more, I want to say, solid in a sense. Because once I went back and read the version of Romans we have, it feels like there are segments that are jutted in as you read
Yeah.
it. It feels like if you just read the parts that Marcion would have had, it reads so smooth and flows. But when you add in what we have elsewhere, it just kind of feels like it's jutted in there. And of course, it
Mhm.
does. Obviously there's some smoothness to it because it's been smoothed over, obviously. But
Right.
you can really get that feel from reading it, and so you just have to really look around for that. But there are scholars that are working on that, and even Jack Bull is of that same opinion, and he noted it in his most recent interview with History Valley podcast, Jacob Berman, YouTube channel. It was asked in one of the Q&As, and he elaborates, and he very explicitly says that he agrees with later dating for Matthew, and even says it's definitely a second century text.
For sure. Yeah. I've heard a lot of scholarship and know a lot of people who side with the second century dating. I have no problem with it. In fact, I kind of agree with it. But I always approach things with, let's concede with them and still take out their arguments. So I have no problem saying Luke and Matthew were written in the 80s. Mark was in the 70s. What we do have, though, is in Mark, which we know is the earliest gospel regardless, is you have a very melancholy tone to the gospel. Certainly written to a Jewish Christian community possibly who just witnessed their temple be destroyed. It's somber. How are we going to get through this? And then Matthew and Luke come along. They have the entire Gospel of Mark in their Gospels, and then they add in all these extras. So yeah, I have no problem with either approach. But if we're going strictly off of scholarship, I do think the second century dating holds more water.
Yeah, and a lot of
But no,
scholars are starting to lean that way, and
that's where we need to just be like, well, okay, well, we'll concede to your point, but we're still going to show you that there's issues, right?
yeah, and so a lot of scholars are starting to lean towards Marcion priority when it comes to the dating of the Gospels and even the Pauline epistles. And
Mm-hmm.
like I said, I've looked at a lot of that scholarship, and it's very much pretty solid. It
Mm-hmm.
makes sense of a lot of other things as well, and I've even traced some of that going to textual criticism and how it actually makes sense with what a lot of textual critics have noticed about the New Testament in particular. And it makes sense of how they've been able to piece it together, how it was possibly constructed and how it adapted and was changed over time, how it
Right.
was redacted and edited, and this would actually account for so much of that. It would all
Oh,
fall into
oh
place
yeah.
so much more properly, and it's amazing. So
Yeah.
I
Just for some examples, you have the pro-Samaritan voice. You have really a pro-Herodian voice. I mean, there are parts where they demonize him a little bit, but some of your most notable personalities in the New Testament are either related or friends with the Herodians. So we're really seeing a pro voice in the Gospels, New Testament, Acts that sides on the opposite of Judaism and really takes, whether it be that Samaritan side of things or the Herodian Roman side of things. So as the empire flourishes, definitely we can see that there had to be multiple hands and fingers in
yeah
making what we have today. Definitely.
yeah there was a lot of syncretism that had to go on before we got our final product. Okay, good.
It's pretty popular to have this whole supernatural conception story.
You know what else was popular in Jewish culture? Supernatural birth stories. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90. We also have supernatural birth stories regarding Jacob and Esau, Joseph, Samson, Samuel, John the Baptist. No, these aren't virgin births, but they are miraculous births, and this shows that this is a very popular theme in Judaism, not paganism. The pagan examples that she puts up on the screen here are not anything remotely like the virgin birth story that we find in the Gospels. Romulus and his twin brother Remus were conceived by a virgin priestess after the god Mars raped her and impregnated her. Hercules' mother was said to have caught Zeus's eye, and he pretended to be her fiancé and impregnated her. Asclepius was the son of Apollo and a mortal woman named Coronis. When Coronis had sex with a mortal man named Ischys, Apollo got extremely jealous and killed him. Coronis was then killed by Artemis for not being faithful to Apollo. Coronis was laid out on a funeral pyre and about to have their body burned, but Apollo rescued the child by cutting him from Coronis' womb. In other words, he was the first C-section. None of these are very convincing parallels. Raymond Brown is a well-known New Testament scholar, and he's famous for casting doubt on the historical accuracy of the gospel birth narratives. But even he thinks that these parallelomania theories are hogwash. In his book, The Birth of the Messiah, Brown writes, "How attractive or acceptable would these pagan legends have been to Greek-speaking Jewish Christians? Would they have wanted to model the conception of Jesus after them? Many of the legends involve gross or amoral sexual conduct on the part of the deity who is thought to have begotten the child. In Wisdom 14:24 through 26 and Romans 1:24 show how Greek-speaking Jews and Jewish Christians would react to such conduct."
The scariest part is this adoption then disqualifies Jesus' claim to even be the Messiah because it makes his genealogy untraceable. Watch Christians try to explain the whole genealogy thing because it's only through Joseph's line, not Mary's, do you get to the connection of King.
Sorry about that. So for his last thing, I do
I
have
have to
some
disagree
comments.
with him. Sorry. I'm just gonna have to disagree with him on just about everything he said. just because there's a parallel, adding morality into a parallel doesn't negate the parallel.
Exactly.
Like, of course you're speaking to a more moral people, so you're going to have to moralize the story. But we're talking about deep-rooted concepts, virgin births, demigods, divine impregnations, and in regards to the rape he brought up, in the narrative, I would say this is Luke's narrative. God doesn't, the angel doesn't really give Mary a choice. It says you're going to be overshadowed by the Holy Spirit and you're going to get pregnant. She doesn't say, you don't really have my consent, so you know what I mean? So he can try to take that amoralization stance all he wants, but we're looking at the backbone of the narrative, not the semantics. We already know that the Greek religion was an amoral institution. A lot of their myths were very amoral. The whole point of their offerings was to just bribe their gods, right? So adding a sense of morality into their stories would have been probably very attractive, right? So now we have a moral stance to live our lives via religion, but that doesn't negate the fact that the parallels are still there.
Yeah. What I was gonna get at is he is correct. There are miraculous stories like certain conceptions that we have in the Tanakh. There are stories like that, but there's no virgin birth, and so exactly what you said, you can't make that jump, and so he tries to pave over that jump.
Right. All the miraculous births he talks about are with old barren women.
Yeah.
But they still gave birth through the sexual union of man and woman. There was no overshadowing, so.
Exactly, and one thing I do want to point out, if he wants to whip out a scholar with that last critique of his, I'll whip out a scholar here myself. Hit me for that appeal to scholarship fallacy. Dr. David Litwa has done a lot of work on this kind of stuff, and he's making his rounds on Gnostic Informant, another brilliant YouTube channel, and he covers a lot of the Gnostic roots that Christianity has in its closet. He covers a lot of that, and so he demonstrates very plainly. And I'm currently reading Deus Esis, I think. I cannot say Latin to save my life anymore. There he discusses the Mediterranean parallels and deification of Jesus to show that there was clear influence in the portrayals of Jesus within early Christian mythos.
Right.
And so when there's that much clear influence and interaction, yeah, that doesn't mean that the stories are going to match exactly. So looking at the virgin birth narrative, a lot of those examples he listed don't really they don't really help his case in any sense. They don't really, because the parallel is that there's a virgin giving birth. The manner in which that child is conceived is different, but as you just pointed out, Steve, it's not really all that different in how it's being in how the act is being perpetrated.
Right. Let me use some like more modern examples that people will be able to relate with in this same vein.
Yeah, go.
When J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, he outright said that the dwarves are modeled after the nation of Israel. You know, they go through wars, they're a warlike people, and they get exiled from their home. We see that it's a retelling of a biblical narrative, but really has nothing to do with each other, right?
Yeah.
That's a prime example of how you can use prior knowledge, prior literary motifs, and tell the same story with different characters, different people, different morality in a fantasy land, really. Another example, the movie that's taken the world by storm right now, Avatar 2. The original Avatar, James Cameron. People, you know, there are many of articles written. Is Avatar a retelling of, you know, are the Navi, you know, they're called the Navi, that's the Hebrew word for prophet. Are they just a dramatization of the Jewish people? So we see that people take concepts and use them as the backbone for their own narrative and write a fairy tale, right? So what is the difference here? You know, we live in a modern Christian world. J.R.R. Tolkien was a Christian, very open about it too. So you're going to take the concepts your readers are going to understand. So if it's a Greek Jewish audience, as he claims, which I'm fine with, but the majority was non-Jewish in a Greek-speaking world, are you going to relay all these new ideas, or are you going to repackage old ideas in a now moral state, right? Something that they can relate to, but also teach them moral concepts. So his whole stance here is just, it goes against everything, not only in ancient and modern literature, but really just in common sense, you know.
All right, we can continue now.
Numbers 118. Father alone is tribe identification.
Okay, come on now. Seriously? Joseph is Jesus' adoptive father. He's from the line of David. Mary also is from the line of David. Law teaches that if a man dies, leaving no sons or daughters, the inheritance is passed on through the daughters and her husbands, provided that they marry within the tribe. Therefore, the daughter's inheritance is joined with her husband's. While this doesn't necessarily deal with genealogy, it does deal with passing on a family inheritance through a daughter, certainly a related concept. And are you really trying to say that Jesus is disqualified from being the Messiah because God is his father? Do you think that this technicality really amounts to much of anything?
The Isaiah prophecy, it says Alma.
So I have a few things to say on that.
I have a lot to say on that.
All right, well, I have a few things, so let me run through mine, and then I want to hear what you have to say, because you have probably a lot more on this than I do. From what I understand so far and what I've learned, it's based on genetics. And so the tribe identity can only be passed down from a child's biological father, meaning if a Jewish woman went and married someone who was not Jewish, a man that was not Jewish, while the kids may very much enjoy the title of being Jewish genetically, they do not have any tribe identity
Right.
because they are not they don't have a biological father to give them that that identity.
That's why a convert, when their Hebrew name is written out on their you know, their basically birth certificate, you know, it's Ben Avram, right? So it'd be Ben Avraham, and yet your father is Abraham. You're considered completely Jewish, but you don't have a tribe. That's how a conversion works. So
Yeah, and so if even if Jesus was adopted into Joseph's family, let's give them this. Let's say Jesus was, he would not have any tribe identity from Joseph.
Right.
So that his anything he really says on that, it becomes moot. And here he actually does try and make a comparison, but it doesn't actually fly. They're very different ruling sets for very different occurrences and events. They don't have any real major overlap from my understanding, and I'm pretty sure that's been the general understanding of it for a while.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah, I'm going to quote two passages of scripture on this,
okay,
and then I'll go into a little bit of halachic commentary.
sure.
So first, I'm going to comment on his idea of the daughters of Zelophehad. He's just so off base. Inheriting property is completely different than genetics, than a dynastic male-to-male line, right? So, for example, Numbers 36:6. This is the thing which the Lord does command concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, saying, let them marry whom they think best, only to the family of the tribe of their father shall they marry. So he does bring that up, that they have to marry within their tribe. Why is that? Because this does get iffy later, and the Jubilee. Okay, we don't have to get into all that, but they have to marry within their tribe because Manasseh can only be transferred to Manasseh, right? The tribal inheritance has to go to someone of the tribe of Manasseh, right? Men of the tribe of Manasseh. But that's not talking about, for example, let's say Solomon had no sons and he had a daughter. So does that mean if she marries a man from the tribe of Judah, he could sit as king? I don't think anyone would believe that. And this was the stark contrast, and there's a lot of halakhic ruling written on the two ideas of adoption, whether it be in Judaism versus the Roman idea of adoption, which is what he's really leaning on right here. The Roman idea of adoption was a man, if he so wished, could create a relationship with an unrelated fellow, boy, and name him as heir in a dynastic sense. Judaism doesn't work that way. She's completely right by saying that in Numbers chapter 1, it goes male to male, patrilineally, discerned by your father's house. And from that, I will quote 2 Samuel 7:12. Speaking to David, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body. That's important. It's showing that it has to be a genetic DNA, physical, from your body descendant. Now, if adoption fell into that category, okay, but why would, the Tanakh doesn't waste words. So why would Hashem bother to say, who shall come from your body, and I will establish your kingdom? It's disqualifying adoption. That's the entire point. So now I'll just read some of these commentaries. These are the sources for the commentary are different websites, but they're halachic websites, where Torah.com, Chabad.com, and they're citing, the Megillah, the Talmud, etc. So the first excerpt is, while the adopted child may be permitted to take on the name of the assuming family, according to Jewish law, the child is hereditarily tied to his or her biological parents. That's important. If the child's biological father is a Kohen or Levi by Jewish tradition, and the child is a boy, so too must he accept these priestly customs. Although discouraged, the adoptee child may even marry a person from the adopting family. Since the child is not from the adopting family's hereditary blood, this marriage would not be considered incest. Now, if adoption, as he defines it, is true in Judaism, how is this possible? How could an adopted son marry his sister? I mean, it's not saying it's encouraged, but it's halakhically allowed. So clearly, biologically, he is not their son.
Yeah. It's two separate laws for two separate types of rulings.
Right.
And so to try and what we see here is really Christianity leaning towards its Roman roots again. It's really what
Right.
it's doing.
That is 100% the Roman mode of adoption and not Judaism's.
Exactly.
I mean, I think this might be the Megillah. It says straight out, like, the most optimal form of, quote unquote, creating more Jewish people is through the union of a man and a woman having their own offspring. But adoption is a very, very honorable thing, even if it's a non-Jewish child, because this child then has the option to convert to Judaism. So really, and this applies for foster children too. So one more thing I'd like to bring up is the idea of yichud. Have you heard of that? Okay, yichud is like modesty. Okay, so the child is still technically considered the child of his or her biological parents, which means that a child born to a non-Jewish mother is a non-Jew, and a child born to a Jewish mother is considered a Jew, regardless of the regardless of the subsequent upbringing. For that matter, they remain related to their biological siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, etc. This is important for an adopted child to know so that they do not inadvertently enter into an incestuous relationship. Additionally, since they are not technically related to their adopted parents or siblings, all restrictions of yichud, which means not being alone with a member of the opposite gender, apply exactly as they would to unrelated people. So yichud with an adopted child may even be more stringent than with a stranger, since it would fall under the category of libo gas ba. Note that these halachos apply to foster children and stepchildren. And this is directly from Devar Halacha 720.
That makes
so
sense.
Adopted child is not your biological child, period.
Yeah. And so this is very much an insertion of the motif that was running around in the Greco-Roman world. The idea of divine conception. This is what I think is it was more of an insertion that occurred. And it was done in a very certain way, this insertion. And this insertion occurred to make it more appealing or to placate a certain group that was already present or was joining. And so this can go either way. Maybe it's the synchronization of certain different tribes of early Christians from the first and second century. And so there's some speculation to be made here, but it's very clear that this is something that came in, was not originally native, because it's not Jewish. Virgin birth concept is not Jewish. And so it came from somewhere, if not from Judaism, where? And the reason apologists will fight so hard for this is because they have to keep the virgin birth narrative in because it's already in there.
Yeah.
It's something they're stuck with. And so they have to defend it.
Yep.
And so that's what we see here, and he's desperately trying to defend something that very much has no grounds. I think we'll see more of that down the line. Let's go ahead and hit the play.
One final comment he brings up about Mary's genealogy. First of all, Luke never says that, but I'll concede it. I'll concede it is. So, okay, he has a point with the daughters of Zelophehad, right? Granted, of course, that Mary has no brothers. When Joseph adopts him, sure, Jesus could, if they're both from the tribe of Judah, as he's asserting, fine. Jesus could get Joseph's money. Jesus could take over Joseph's business as a carpenter. But Is Jesus the son of Joseph? No. He does not have Joseph's DNA, period. He has no claim to the Davidic throne through Joseph as they try to propose. It's halachically impossible.
It's a very open and shut case, but apologists will try and paint it to be some bigger thing. That's why I think he very much starts out with that attitude that he comes out with, because he wants to play it down.
Right.
So that's going to be his main tactic, is to play it down. So what little bit of information he throws out, where it's not very valid at all anyway, you won't question it. And you'll accept his little comparison.
I suspect he's never actually studied halacha, because his argument is basically word for word Michael Brown. So we can see who he's studying and what he's not,
Yeah.
Young woman, not virgin. Kennedy, you really got to get grafted back into that olive branch, because in Judaism, when a woman conceives on the first night of her wedding night, it's considered a miraculous conception, but certainly does not denote a virgin birth or no natural father's involvement. And the prophet Isaiah was Jewish. The whole book is Jewish.
Okay, you went off on some tangent there at the end, and I'm not really sure that I'm following, but hold on for just a second. First, you said that the virgin birth was stolen from pagan myths and pagan stories, but now you're saying that Matthew mistranslated Isaiah, Jewish scriptures, and invented the virgin birth? Don't you see just a little bit of tension here?
Pick a plot line!
But let's talk about the Hebrew word alma. The Hebrew word alma occurs 6 different times.
So before he gets into this next part, since apparently we're going into Alma, I do want to point something out very quickly here. He makes a very grievous error at the start of this little argument of his. Testify.
But sorry, I didn't hear you. What'd you say?
Testify makes a very, very simple error here, and I think it's just an error of ignorance. You see, he tries to make the idea that what she's presenting, these two very different points, cannot be put together. That these 2 points draw very different conclusions from one another. And so he tries to discredit her in a sense, and in his viewer's eye, that's how it's going to be understood, as an attempt to discredit or devalue her argument.
Right.
And so, whether that's his intention or not, that's what's occurred. And so what we have here is he is trying to say to his viewers, her 2 arguments here, this idea that it's from the pagan world and this idea that it's a mistranslation, can't work together. But they very much can, and in fact, I'll explain further down the line, but the pagan influence would actually account for the mistranslation.
Definitely.
He just wants to keep his viewers from making that connection. He wants them to think they are unrelated, rather than allowing his viewers to connect the dots that all scholarship has, that pagan influence more likely caused the mistranslation.
Right.
Now, whether intentional or unintentional is something that is up for debate, but there is no debate that this was all a chain reaction.
Exactly.
Sorry, I almost choked myself.
But you read through your worldview. You read through your presupposition.
Exactly.
Right? And we know that Matthew didn't have a very firm grasp on the Hebrew language, just from, or biblical poetry for that matter, just from the triumphal entry in Matthew 21, which he says that Jesus rode in on 2 animals, right? It's minutia, but I do believe he's quoting the book of Zechariah, chapter 9, and sorry, but doesn't work. Zechariah doesn't say that. Zechariah uses biblical poetry to say rides in on an ass, comma. There's no comma in the Hebrew language, but that's how we would differentiate. He rides in on an ass, comma, the foal of an ass. Now, Matthew, with his lackluster grasp of the Hebrew language, interprets that as two animals. Mark actually gets it right. Matthew must have had it in front of him, Mark, and whether it be, the quote unquote Septuagint or the actual Hebrew in front of him. He must have thought Mark was wrong and reinterprets it incorrectly. So to say that Matthew doesn't make mistakes and that these two concepts can't be umbilically connected, it's just really off base. I've never heard this guy before. He's I'll give it to you. He does seem like he does a bit of research, but at the same time, he certainly keeps a smoke screen up.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. Testify is brilliant. I've watched his videos. He knows his arguments. He knows his stuff. He does his research. He's not foolish by any means. He doesn't lack knowledge. What he does lack is the willingness to acknowledge when there's an error and that he needs to face the facts. But instead he buckles down, which is what most apologists are doing, is they're buckling down and trying to bail water out of a boat that's already sitting at the bottom of the lake.
Yeah. And shout out, he says that this TikToker failed to debunk the virgin birth. Shout out to this TikToker. She actually is doing pretty good.
Yeah, she's standing on solid ground. And you gotta admit, she's doing well for like the TikToks. I think you only get 30 seconds, 60 seconds, or 3 minutes.
Something like that.
You gotta have the information to fill out the time, otherwise you're just gonna be running a very long, boring TikTok, or you're gonna have too much to say and never say at all. So she's doing very well with those time constraints. So she's done very well on her presentation.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's see what he says.
Testament. Let's take a look at these passages and see if they could ever mean virgin. There's Genesis 24:43, where Rebecca was Isaac's bride to be. In the same chapter, she's called a girl. She's also called a virgin. And in verse 16, she's called a maiden or alma. All three words describe a virgin young woman. Exodus 2:8, Miriam's sister Moses is called an alma. She's living at home with her parents, so it's pretty easy to infer that she's probably still a virgin. There are some other passages in the Psalms and First Chronicles that are indeterminate. And then there's Proverbs 30:19. This verse describes the way of a man with an alma. In the context, Proverbs 20:18 through 20 refers to 4 incomprehensible things: an eagle in the sky, a serpent on a rock, a ship at sea, and a man with an alma. What do all 4 things have in common? Well, they are all things that can disappear rather quickly. An eagle flies away from sight, a serpent slithers off a rock, and a ship disappears. And well, a virgin can lose her virginity in a heartbeat.
That's what she said.
Dr. Michael Heiser is an Old Testament scholar with a PhD in Semitic languages.
Before we get there, see if you can back it up to his little slide of the Proverbs 30:18 through 19 real fast. Alright, so I do want to make a point real fast that he uses a lot of very particular language when he's discussing this, and you can almost feel the shift, especially if you know what to look for. You can feel his tone shift very quickly, and from playful banter to attack mode. And so I caught that shift very quickly, and I said, "Wow, you went from 0 to 100 real quick." So I guess we'll go from 0 to 100 very quickly.
Yeah,
So,
he. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
He omits a pivotal verse here.
Indeed, that is the main point here.
He omits 18, 19, and then the omission is verse 20, which tells you what exactly these 4 things are describing.
May I read that for you?
Yeah, go right ahead.
3 things are beyond me, 4 I cannot fathom. How an eagle makes its way over the sky, how a snake makes its way over a rock, how a ship makes its way through the high seas, how a man has his way with a young woman. Such is the way of an adulteress. She eats, she wipes her mouth, and says, I have done no wrong. For in particular, Solomon in this passage is comparing the acts of a cheating spouse to things that also leave no trace. And so this young woman here is being compared to an adulterous woman, as he very clearly states.
Mm-hmm.
And so to draw the inference that Alma means virgin in this verse in particular is one, an error,
Right.
and two, an error that he also uses as a smokescreen for his actual argument.
Mm-hmm.
Because the actual verse that is used to justify the virgin birth in the Christian narrative is Isaiah 7:14.
Right.
And so in that verse, and he acknowledges this, it comes from the context of the word.
Mm-hmm.
And the context of the word Alma comes from the surrounding verses. Testify.
Yeah.
Did we testify? We went to church, my friend. Did we not learn in Sunday school that we're supposed to read the surrounding verses for
Yeah.
context?
I mean,
And
he
the
even
fact that you
admitted
don't
it,
even list it tells me that you didn't. Your Sunday school teacher is very disappointed in you right now.
Yeah. Right. But he even admitted it. I mean, I picked up on it. I don't think he intended this, but every time, like every example he uses, besides this one, you have to infer that the person being talked about is a virgin,
Exactly.
right? It requires some inference, which goes to show that contextually it's not even talking about virginity.
Exactly.
He misses the whole point of what Proverbs 30 is speaking about. He's insinuating that it has to do with, the quickness of movement. Like that to me just boggles my mind. When really it's talking about what comes afterwards, right? After an eagle is flown away, you don't see a trace.
Nothing there.
There's nothing there. After a snake has slithered off the rock. Why a rock? Because it's not dirt. A snake slithers in the dirt, you'll see its track. But off a rock, there will be nothing there.
Exactly.
Ship on the high seas. Once the wake is gone, it's like the boat wasn't even there, right?
Exactly.
And finally, way of a man with a young woman. How do I know this couldn't be a virgin? Because anatomically, let's think. The first time a woman has sex, with very, very, very few exceptions, there is a breaking of the hymen. Pardon the, being anatomical here, but there's the breaking of the hymen and she bleeds. So right?
Yeah.
That's exactly why he has to omit verse 20. It's the
context in and of itself.
Yeah, he's pulling the wool over people's eyes here.
Exactly,
So,
and that's why if you listen very carefully, he actually mutters 18 through 20 very quickly.
mm-hmm.
To almost make it sound like he's thinking or doing something that's slightly preoccupying him. But this way he can also say, well, I did mention it. But he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't put it on screen, and that's an intentional bit of misdirection, like a street magician doing an illusion with
Right.
some cards or coins. He draws your attention elsewhere with this verse 18 through 19 on your screen, while only briefly mentioning his little small text at the bottom of the screen, the
Right.
fine print.
And he didn't put in those video bites to take your attention off of exactly what he's saying. And there's an eagle, there's a snake, and there's a boat, right?
Yep.
That wasn't just some impromptu added effect. That was to pull your focus, right? Ooh, shiny. That was to pull your focus on what he's actually talking about.
Yeah. And most people will wonder, well, an apologist is here to help me learn. Why would they do this? Well, that's actually what apologists are taught to do. They're taught these tactics. These are debate tactics.
Mm-hmm.
These are argument tactics.
Right. Apologia means
to
defend. He's not here to teach you. He's here to avert your eyes.
Exactly. He's here to give you propaganda. Propaganda that you can hand out, that you can regurgitate at people, because that's all it is propaganda. And I'm sorry, but this propaganda is very, very poor. And when it caught my eye, I had to respond. I can't just sit idly by. And it's the responsibility of all of us who have this knowledge to share it so that there is not this ignorance that goes around. And so this is apologetical tactic at its finest. Take notes. Good.
Here, rather quickly, an eagle flies away from sight, a serpent slithers off a rock, and a ship disappears. And well, a virgin can lose her virginity in a heartbeat.
That's what she said.
Dr. Michael Heiser is an Old Testament scholar with a PhD in Semitic languages. After reviewing these passages, he concludes, quote, in ancient patriarchal culture, a woman of marriageable age like Mary was a female who had at least reached puberty and would be capable of bearing children. Daughters in such a culture were under close supervision and restraint. Even in today's sex-saturated culture, a significant number of girls in their teen years are virgins. How much more for those in a patriarchal culture? Matthew was raised in this culture, so it should not surprise us that he saw no incongruity with understanding Alma being virgin. The bottom line is that it's
Go
simply
back
false
to
to
that
say
quote if you can. Go back to that citation from Heiser. Because I want to point out another very interesting little snippet here. So, the quote is framed to support what Testify is trying to assert. Problem is, this is very much an appeal to authority, but a misplaced one.
Mm-hmm.
Because what Heiser is saying here is he can understand the lenses that the author of Matthew would have been reading the text with to see the word Alma to mean virgin, or how they could understand it. In fact, there's another good book out there discussing this. I don't remember the names of the authors off the top of my head, but it's called The Bible with and Without Jesus. How Jews and Christians can read the same stories but draw different conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm not sure that's the exact title. It's a while since I've read it, but nonetheless, somewhere along those lines, and several authors, but the book covers how there are these lenses that, this is not the example they use, but there is a manner in which Christians read the text, and they're committing form of eisegesis subconsciously,
Mm-hmm.
because they're reading these texts and expecting to find Jesus there. And so that's exactly what Heiser is acknowledging, is that the author of Matthew would have been reading these texts expecting to find this in there.
Exactly.
He would have been looking for it. He was fishing for it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to play by that logic, well, then most certainly then Jehovah's Witnesses, bless you, most certainly the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons are just as Christian as all the other Christians
Mm-hmm.
by this same logic, because it's in there. And if you ever argue with a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon, they can quote scripture at you.
Mm-hmm.
They can do it, and some better than most Christians. And so this is very much a misplacement of this quote. He frames it so it appears or sounds like it's supporting his argument.
Mm-hmm.
And so while it does give him the support of that, yes, Matthew, the author of Matthew, would have had these lenses, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what the text is saying.
Right.
Saying that this is what the author would have read it as, not what
Mm-hmm.
it says in the plain text.
Yeah.
So therefore it is an inference over the text, and that is the general consensus of
And
all scholarship mostly on this point.
further, actually, using of patriarchal culture kind of hurts his point a little bit. Because what's that?
Also,
because I mean, he's coming out the gate in ancient patriarchal culture. It means a woman of marriageable age, right? So you're now conceding the fact that women were married off younger. You're now conceding the fact that, because he brings up the sexualized nature of today, where most teens are virgins. Okay, well, in the ancient, people need to understand how like betrothals and marriage rights worked. You know, um, women were married off a lot younger. You know, so for him to use sexualization as if as soon as that woman's hitting puberty, you know, she's now capable of marriage, and contrasting that with, well, modern girls have sex a lot more than girls did back then, but most teens are still virgins. That's just a very strange route to take. Do you know?
it's
Am
an
I making
assumption
sense?
that you have to make.
Right.
Because something that I will also bring up is you don't make a rule against something unless it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so where there is some amount of prohibition and rabbinic interpretation of scripture against sex outside of marriage, why do you think that interpretation was made? Probably made because it was happening. That there
Right.
was probably relationships happening outside of the marital union. And
Mm-hmm.
so they had to respond and say, no, this is the official ruling. This is what the law of Moses says. We can't change it. This is what it says.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so he has to take this into consideration that while yes, you could make the inference that because of these laws, most definitely there were some women who weren't very promiscuous, if at all. But that doesn't mean that there weren't, and that can't disqualify Mary from being any manner like that. That is an inference you have
Right.
to make,
Right.
and a character trait you have to assign to her, in the assumption that it's going to back your own argument and bolster your claim.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Because we don't have information on Mary like that outside of what it says in the New Testament. But how do we know that's exact? How do we know that's not an embellishment or an addition that occurs later? And from the
Mm-hmm.
looks of the scholarship, it very much appears that this is a later addition.
Right. Especially when we have an attitude of Joseph of disdain at first.
Mhm.
Right. He
Yeah,
was going to put her away. He's going to divorce her because you cheated on me. And he had
yeah,
to get some reassurance.
yeah,
Why not let him know beforehand? Right.
exactly. And if you want to get really semantic with it, how would a dream honestly convince someone to keep a cheating spouse? I can understand maybe if they didn't have a good head on their shoulders, but a dream is a dream, and him making important life decisions, especially that day and age where your survival wasn't really assured.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he might take her, but probably a better chance he wouldn't because she's just going to continue to be promiscuous.
Right.
He has a trade, he has a livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
So in reality, he would almost be considered, the prize man in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
He- So there's there's an argument that can make it go both ways. And so the way he spins this quotation to make it sound like it supports his argument, it really doesn't. It really doesn't support it at all, and it's just a blanket that he throws over it so you don't question the fire that's right behind it.
Right.
Ma to mean virgin. The bottom line is that it's simply false to say that Alma can never mean virgin. A bunch of bad arguments against the virgin birth just doesn't make a good argument against it.
All right. I do want to say one last thing on that. He is really just trying to secure his spot in the orthodoxy, the straight thinking party with that little statement, because he is absolutely right with that statement. He is absolutely right to say that the word Alma can never refer to or mean a virgin. He was absolutely right. It's contextual based on the context. So he just asserts that at the last minute to kind of put in his 2 cents, but in reality, his viewers are going to take it to a very different level. They're going to understand it in a different manner than anyone who has already studied the scholarship and knows what he's realistically saying.
Mm-hmm.
There's nuance that he's put over it.
For sure. And even though it depends on context, Alma is never denoting um,
Exactly.
virginship. You know what I mean? It's never
Exactly.
denoting
It's not its
the
definition. It's not what the word in and of itself translates to or means.
exactly
It
exactly.
means
So
young woman.
young
It refers to young
man,
woman. Now, the sexual history of that young woman is not denoted by Alma, but it can be inferred along with Alma.
right. And if it's talking about a young woman who's 13, okay, you can certainly infer maybe she's a virgin. But there's nothing in the denotation of what the word actually means that has anything to do with that. Like you would have to pull it from context. And I think it's just a very, dare I say, dishonest way of composing apologetics to rely everything on connotation and inference and well, it could mean this. Well, okay, the whole Hebrew Bible could mean anything if you wanna read it that way. Do you know what I
Exactly.
mean?
Exactly.
So Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
just a very, very, in my humble opinion, which doesn't mean too much, it's just a very dishonest approach.
It is. It's
Whether
very
he
intellectually
understands.
dishonest
Mm-hmm.
because he misrepresents the information, and he does it to push, much like the gospel writers, to push a narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and they do it to push that agenda, and that is the agenda of Christianity, and
Yep.
their agenda is quite notorious.
Mm-hmm.
So, any last words before I say my final remarks to Testify, our dear friend?
Just, check the things out yourself. Do your own research. I don't really have much more to say than that besides, try to learn a little bit of Hebrew. And, go into these things with an open mind. Try to get out of this. Try to get out of 2023, since that's probably when this will be posted. Try to pull your mind out of 2023 and, try to look at these texts from the time period they were going on. For example, Isaiah 7:14 was the person who's receiving being told the prophecy in any state of mind or spiritual level to care about a person that'll be born 700 years later, right? Us in hindsight might be like, a Christian in hindsight might be like, yeah, it's definitely about Jesus, but
Yeah.
was Ahaz the king, the wicked king who was being told these words by Isaiah, would he have cared when he had an imminent danger going on right outside his city walls? Would he have cared about a little carpenter boy who was born 700 years later? So we need so much historical and contextual background to really just get to the bottom of these things. So, take the time, study out yourself, read with a commentary, preferably not a Christian. but yeah, go ahead, make your final remarks.
And that's why I recommend because I do plan to link this in the comment section to the lovely commenter and Testify's own video who requested that I explain my accusations. Here you go. Like I said, it was coming, and here it is. The other thing is, I agree 100% with you, Steve. To all of Testify's viewers, anyone that watches this in general, to Steve viewers, do research, study this stuff. Don't just listen to even just us on here rambling about it. Don't just listen to us. Go look at the sources we give you that we list off. I'm going to give Steve a copy of a bibliography I mocked up just for this occasion. So, go through there. He'll put that in the description, I'm certain, so you can, or link to it or something. And so you can go look at this information yourself. You can go find out the truth for yourself. You don't need to listen to an apologist's pretty words. You don't need to listen to our slightly stumblier words. You can look it up for yourself. So I very much am adamantly behind that. And another thing I want to say is don't let theology dictate your history. Allow the historical context to bring out the text's theology.
Exactly.
And it is exactly the opposite that Testify is doing. He's allowing his theology, the things that are in his text that he has to defend because they are a part of his belief that he can't give up. These traditions that are not Jewish. And instead he tries to defend them, and he's allowing it to color his interpretation of the history. And the interpretation of the history everywhere else is saying, we don't agree with you.
Right.
Doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So do your research. Stay hungry for knowledge. Don't let theology dictate your history. And have a wonderful new year.
Thanks.